Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Lavers. I'm the international news editor for the Washington and Los Angeles Blade, and it's a real honor for me to be here today with our esteemed panelists. It's a really important discussion we're going to have. And so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and briefly introduce our panelists, and then we will begin from there. So it's a real honor for me to welcome Bambi Salcedo, the president of the Trans Latina Coalition. Hello. And then secondly, Dago Bailon with Trans Queer Pueblo in Arizona. Dago, thank you so much for being here today. And then last but certainly not least, Marco Antonio Quiroga. He is with the Contigo Fund in Orlando, Florida. So Marco, thank you so much for being here today. And so I'd like to just go ahead and get started just for the benefit of our audience who may not be familiar with the work that you and your wonderful organizations do. So Bambi, why don't we go ahead and start with you? If you can just talk a little bit about the Trans Latina Coalition and the work that you do, not only in California, but across the country.
Bueno, primero que nada, a mí me gusta agradecer a mi creador, mi poder superior, por darme la oportunidad de estar aquí con ustedes. Y también quiero honrar a la gente que nos acompaña. I know that it was probably hard for some of you to understand what I just said, but it is a customary thing that I always acknowledge my creator, my higher power, for giving me the opportunity to breathe one more day. And I also obviously want to honor the people who are joining us. And I am just so incredibly grateful that I get to share space with amazing individuals who I love and respect and admire for the work that they do. So, you know, my name is Bambi Salcedo, and I do have the privilege to be the president and the CEO of the Trans Latina Coalition, which is a national advocacy organization that is based in Los Angeles that also provides life-saving supportive services to trans and gender nonconforming people in Los Angeles. We're the only trans-led organization that is providing this type of services to our community. And, you know, we do a bunch of stuff, but in terms of immigration, that's how we actually started initially in 2009. Back then, there were a couple of prominent national translator organizations that obviously were doing amazing work, but unfortunately, we're not including the voices of trans Latinas immigrant women who were living in this country, but also have gone through the immigration detention process or the immigration process in general. And so for us, it was important for us to start organizing and to start thinking about how do we support trans people who are inside, and also how do we support those who are getting out of immigration detention. And so that has been at the core of the work that we do. But, you know, one of the things that we were doing also on a volunteer basis, because that's how we started, it was to organize people, right? Like on the ground. And one of the things that we were seeing is that our community we're not having access to the basic services that many of us take for granted. And that's why our national group decided that in 2015 that we needed to also move into doing service provision. And that's how we started, you know, building the Center for Violence Prevention and Transgender Wellness here in Los Angeles, to serve as a model for other members of our organization to be part of and to follow, if you will. And so since then, and just, you know, the last 4 years, which was when we first got our first grant, other organization members, like in Florida, for instance, there's Ariana Center. In New York, there's Transgrediendo. And, you know, in Georgia, there's Community Estrella. So they're starting to build also the service provision part of it. And so I'm just super grateful and glad that I get to be part of all of this amazing work.
Thank you. Gracias, Bambi. Dago, tell us about Trans Queer Pueblo in Phoenix and the work that you do.
Of course. Hi, excited to see all of you. Yeah, super excited. I think it's been quite a year. We haven't been able to see each other, and I think I think our communities are bracing for the worst of this pandemic because, as we know, right, as LGBT trans queer people, we're highly affected by like whatever catastrophes happen in the U.S. So, Trans Queer Pueblo. But enough about that. Trans Queer Pueblo. We're an LGBT migrant organization here in Phoenix. I'm Dago Bailon. I'm an assistant, so I support the 7 projects that we have. Our main focus is building leadership cycles to create the solutions to our everyday problems. And so that means that we come together with our membership. We have about 400 plus members who are part of really building a Phoenix that reflects them. And understanding, right, that Arizona is a very hostile environment for LGBT people, but also for the LGBT community and migrant communities. And so we have a lot of anti-immigrant laws that really have restricted the access to healthcare, to housing, and different essential services. So in 2011, we found ourselves really asking, what can we do and how can we create some of these services? And so we have built an organization collectively that really supports the holistic needs of LGBT migrants and people of color. We have a free clinic that provides primary care to undocumented individuals, LGBT folks here in Arizona. And that was a success for us because as an undocumented person, I spent about 11 years without being able to see a doctor. And I know that as we continue to do this work of providing health, there's people who haven't seen a doctor for 20 plus years. And also with the understanding that because we support people who are migrating, there's a lot of needs that come with migrating to a new country, to a new state. And so we provide housing, we provide accompaniment support. I think that's what it's called in English, maybe, where we support people in making sure that all of their paperwork is done, that they have their immigration paperwork, that they have their state IDs, that they have their work permits, because a lot of the things that happens is that many of the people don't speak the language or can read English, so sometimes their processes don't fall, ¿cómo se dice? Mi cerebro está pensando en español solamente, so I'm gonna have a little bit of a lag here, just like Facebook. But so we provide holistic support to make sure that everybody is ready to stay in this country and that they don't get deported. Besides that, we work with people who haven't been in detention but have immigration possibilities, or alivios migratorios, which is immigration reliefs that to stay in this country. And so we have trans support groups for non-binary people, and really working also with families to really understand what does LGBT mean, and how do parents become part of resisting, but also building these essential services, not only for them, but for their children also who are affected by some of these things.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dago. And then last but certainly not least, Marco, tell us about Contigo Fund and the work that you and your colleagues do.
Hello, everyone. Marco Antonio Quiroga, he, him, is. I'm here in Orlando, Florida. I'm so happy to be joining brilliant people like Dago and Bambi. Thank you so much for organizing this, Michael. It's always such an honor to share space with you all, doing such amazing work. And so Contigo Fund, Contigo means with you in Spanish for those who speak the language. And Contigo Fund emerged after the 2016 mass incidents of violence that happened here in Orlando, Florida, targeting principally LGBTQ and Latinx and other people of color. And it was the largest single incidence of mass violence against LGBTQ communities up to that point, and single incidents of gun violence as well in modern US history. And it had a really deep impact on the LGBTQ Latinx community here, who at that time didn't even have a single organization that was led by and for LGBTQ Latinx people to really like own community space or spaces for healing or a response center for what the needs were from that community. There wasn't even an LGBTQ culturally competent Spanish-speaking therapist available in the entire Central Florida region to respond to the multiple families who had lost loved ones on that day, who were predominantly monolingual Spanish speakers. So there was so many layering of impact that tragedy had. For one, the LGBTQ Latinx community, two, undocumented people, and three, the broader communities of color that were impacted. And from that emerged a group of national foundations that wanted to respond to the tragedy because of the lack of actual infrastructure and support that existed here in the region for that community historically. And so they pulled together dollars to support the recovery. Part of that was to cover all the administrative costs of this new fund that was set up by the Center for Victims of Crime to support the collection of dollars that were directly meant to support the families of those who had lost loved ones taken from them, and individuals who are physically present in the nightclub to support their recovery. And so that resulted in one of the largest LGBTQ fundraising campaigns in the in history. Over $30 million was raised to support a little over 300 individuals who are physically present at the nightclub with medical bills, with urgent, with long-term care in terms of therapy around the long journey that they would have to take. And then also over 50 families that had loved ones taken from them. And so that supported that piece of the response to the tragedy. And Contigo was the other side of the response. We supported the LGBTQ communities that were impacted, broader communities who were impacted, by starting to identify the needs that the communities described. No places of communities outside of the nightclubs. No organizations that are led by and for individuals who look like them, spoke like them, had their lived experiences. And thirdly, no spaces or places of opportunity for people to lift up their leadership. So individuals would see people in places of leadership that were supposed to be representative of their community, but didn't necessarily have any deeper root connections to that community, like the undocumented community, like communities of color who are living below the poverty line. And so Contigo was an initiative to change all of that. Start investing in leadership development, start investing in grassroots organizations that are led by and for, and start giving power to individuals to make decisions from the communities who are closest to the challenges that they are facing, but also closest to the solutions they know are right for their own communities. And so Contigo since then has been on that journey. Since launching, Contigo supported the emergence of over 15 new LGBTQ organizations that are led by and for LGBTQ Latinx individuals, LGBTQ undocuqueer folks, LGBTQ folks from our Black community, trans, women of color, and so forth. And Contigo has since then become the 5th largest funder of LGBTQ Latinx communities in the nation. And that's made primarily, I'm going to share a link about like funding trends in LGBTQ and Latinx communities that I would love for folks to take a look at. But something that I would really want to point out about this is that, in our less than 5-year journey since the Pulse tragedy, there's been we're now one of the top 5 funders of LGBTQ Latinx communities in the country, But that really speaks to how much of a gap there is in funding LGBTQ Latinx communities, organizations, and efforts in the United States, and how much of a missed opportunity there is when it comes to supporting those intersections of communities. Right, there was a study done by social science research that found that of 4,000 folks in the United States, that finds that queer folks are 20 times more likely to be activists than cis hetero folks, and queer folks don't just advocate for their own rights, but are also more active in other social justice movements. And this past election, we saw a huge movement of voters from the LGBTQ community elect Biden president. Over 81% of voters in a new USA Today news article that found that the new GLAAD poll, which was the first scientific poll of LGBTQ voters, found that 81% of those broke for Biden. And in terms of our movement work, LGBTQ, Latinx, immigrant folks, and people of color have always been at the forefront of our movement, across our movements of justice. And I grew out of the undocumented youth movement, and I can tell you that in that movement, from the very beginning, at the forefront of that movement has always been queer leaders, have always been women, have always been trans leaders. And it's based off of those lessons that we've kind of learned, we're able to make so much incredible progress here in Orlando in terms of movement building, because we are really driven by the values of intersectionality, self-determination of those who are most impacted, and a belief in collective liberation. And that's the journey that we've been on so far, and kind of the lessons that we've taken from from the Pulse tragedy, from multiple crises, in terms of crises from climate disasters that we're experiencing here in the South, to the rise of white supremacy, to the Trump administration, to COVID-19, and so forth, that we've been able to apply from our lessons learned from the Pulse tragedy and beyond.
Great. Thank you so much, Marco. And the topic of this conversation is immigration in the Latino community, but I really want to kind of open the conversation with a broader question, and it's one that I like to ask people, especially those, who are so invested in this issue. So I'm going to start with Dago with this question. So tell us why is immigration an LGBTQ rights issue, and why should folks in the movement not only care about it, but what should they be doing to support and advocate for LGBTQ migrants, immigrants, asylum seekers, etc.? So take it away.
Well, thank you. That's a hard one. No, but I think important, right? I think at the core of we have this saying that Transqueer Pueblo that we use, and we say we're more powerful than needy. So really understanding that the power that we all have will actually lead us to the solutions that we all see, right? But we can't do that if we continue. And I think around POC communities, we really understand the importance, and I think we have seen over the past 4 years how we're building collaborations and partnerships, and really have been pushing to understand how do we achieve rights in a way that actually benefits all of us by putting at the center those people that generally, like the popular movement calls them, at the margins, but are at the center of injustice, right? And so if we are able to place people who experience all of this injustice in the front, then consequently we all will be able to actually have more rights. And I think one of the, and I think when you ask this question, the first thing that comes to mind is white supremacy, right? And the understanding that actually a lot of the white-led organizations are actually still operating under this idea that we can continue to push for piecemeal rights, when actually the past 4 years, and actually this year in particular, has really shown us that actually the government is capable of giving us rights immediately if possible. However, they continue to use us as bargaining coins, right? To say like, well, you gotta wait. We gotta build the right collaborations. We gotta build the right partnerships. And in reality, that is just another way to continue to oppress us. And so I think it is important for everyone, right, who is watching this, to really understand that that if we truly believe in rights and if we want rights, that it is not one-sided, right? We need to look at how actually, for example, undocumented and immigrants are affected by the lack of health insurance. And at the same time, right, we have to look at like why poor people in rural areas who are equally affected by healthcare, who don't have access sometimes to a doctor. But at the same time, right, with the right push, we can continue to make sure that both of these populations have access. And so I think the struggles that we see in this fight for rights are very similar. However, I think white supremacy is the issue, and I think until we're able to understand that actually, if we don't bypass these ideas, and if we don't dedicate more time to educating one another and spending time in collaboration, like we've done these past 4 years to resist this Trump, I don't even know what to call it, this Trump world reality, right? We won't be able to come together.
Bambi, same question to you. Why is immigration an LGBTQ rights issue?
Well, it is an issue because the broader LGBTQ movement has not taken this issue as important to them, right? We know that, similarly to what Dago is saying, right? The gay liberation movement, right, when it started, was primarily led by white gay men and, some white lesbian women, of course. But, migration is something that has happened always, right? But when it comes to members of our community, right, particularly those who are the most poor, and even further, right, like trans people, right, who have to flee their countries because of the violence that we experience, right? And even the violence that we experience, period, here in the United States, right? Just to give you an example, right? Like there has not been an uproar from the broader LGBTQ community about the violence that we experience. I mean, just to give you another example, right? Like we know what happened with the murder of Matthew Shepard, for instance, right? Like there was a significant change, right, in the LGBTQ movement. Well, I'm going to say in the gay and lesbian movement. But how many trans women have been murdered, right? Like just this year, 40 trans women have been murdered. And there has never been an uproar from the broader LGBTQ community. You know what I mean? Like people think that just posting something on social media or sharing an article or something, that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that's not true. And that's why trans people are positioned where we are within, in 2020 within our society. And now that we are experiencing this global pandemic, right, like trans people are going to be set even further behind, despite the fact that we have, in the last 5 years have gained some momentum and have gained some, a little bit of power. And I'm going to say, like, we at the Trans Latina Coalition obviously are sort of like part of that, right? Because it has been only in the last 5 years that there has been some type of investment and investing in the leadership development of trans people, right? So, if we look at the broader issues, right, that trans people face, for instance, migration is one of the things that the broader LGBTQ community don't necessarily think about, or even want to even address, or even want to, invest in. which is unfortunate. That many organizations like ours, like Transqueer Pueblo, that have been doing really amazing work for many many years, and it has just been until recently that people and philanthropy specifically, right, are looking into this and are also investing a little bit, not as it should, right. And so I'm really glad that Marco put this visual, right, they share with us, for us to see the reality that the Latinx LGBTQ community faces, right. So through the work that we do at our organization, there has been individuals who work at foundations who have invested and believe in the work that needs to be done. But if we look at the philanthropic world, right, it's there's it's a multi-billion industry, right, that not a lot of people, or not a lot of organizations, particularly people of color led organization, or black led organization, or trans led organizations, or even immigration work, is not necessarily funded the way it should be. And so this is a serial issue, particularly in our communities, right? And that is why we do the work that we do. As an organization, we want to make sure that we transform the way people and in this case I'm talking about funders, and I'm talking about obviously legislators, right, that they think about the changes that need to happen, and the investment that needs to also happen to support the work of that many of us are doing, but also to support the livelihood of the people who we work with, right. And you know it is to service provision. Like, if we are able to empower our communities, right, with the basic things that they need, again, and that's why we as an organization move into doing service provision, because if we're able to empower our people with food, right, which is a basic thing that people need, if we are able to be able to support our people with housing, or employment, or even transportation for people make it to their appointments, then we can build our community, we can build the power of our community, as Dago was saying, right. And so um many people in the philanthropic world don't necessarily invest in direct services or programs, right. um and so we need to be able to make a connection in terms of the individual, how is that connected to the community, and how do we empower the community as a whole. And also for us to invest in our political, um, in the political process, right, to invest in the advocacy efforts that need to happen for us to be able to change the policies that have been created to continue to marginalize people like myself, people like my sisters, people who we work with, right. And so how do we influence that, and how do we actually hold accountable elected officials who are put in office by the people to serve the people, but obviously they don't understand that, or they don't recognize that, and we need to be able to actually make them accountable for the positions that they hold, and for the power that they hold to really either keep us marginalized, or to help us to get a better place within our society.
I want to touch on something what Dago was saying. We're about, I think, 50, give or take, days from the end of the Trump administration, despite what he's trying to do, challenge the election results. And Dago, you probably know that in Arizona more than most of us, given what was going on there a few weeks ago. I wanted to it certainly has been a very difficult 4 years for a lot of our communities, especially immigrants and immigrant advocacy groups, LGBTQ folks, et cetera. So, Marco, I want to ask you, how has Contigo Fund responded to what has been coming out of the White House for the last 4 years? Can you just shed some light on how you and your colleagues have been responding to the Trump administration's continued assaults on our respective communities?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting enough that 2016 was a very detrimental year for so many folks who are at the center of injustice, as Dago put it. 2016 was the year that the Pulse tragedy happened in June. On November, Trump was essentially for the first time in our modern history, xenophobia was on the ballot, and Trump won on the platform of xenophobia. And for the second time in 2020, again, xenophobia, and very clearly, no, I would say no individual. I may believe an individual who may say maybe I didn't understand well enough what I was voting for in 2016. For someone to say that in 2020 would seem very unbelievable to me when we're talking about the anti-immigrant sentiment that has grown alongside white supremacy across our country in these last 4 years. And so some of the things that we did in terms of like preparing ourselves for all of these multiple crises that we knew were coming down the pipeline because they were increasingly happening to our communities, in particular here in the South, with climate disasters that were affecting impoverished and communities of color more so than in any other part of the country or any other population, or in terms of gun violence, incidences of gun violence across the South, from Charlottesville to down in Texas. Here, multiple instances of gun violence from Stoneman Douglas in South Florida, here in Orlando, and so forth. And so we knew that additional crises were going to occur under this administration for the communities that we care for the most. And some of the things that we focused in on was, well, the communities who are closest to the challenges that we're going to be facing are also the ones who have the right solutions for their own communities. And so creating systems of empowerment for folks to decide where resources need to go, to decide these strategies, to be the decision makers around who gets funding and what gets funded, was one of the most important things. So we're 100% community driven. We have multiple boards. One was a board that decides our annual grant cycle that supports all of the work across over 30 grantee partners that we have here in the local region, who prioritizes LGBTQ intersectional work across that supports LGBTQ communities of color across employment, across services, across leadership development, across organizing and advocacy, and then through that strategy, then starting to address the issues as they come up on a rapid response basis. And with Trump, we've been a rapid response for a while. We've been on defensive for a while. And what that means is setting up mutual aid networks in our local community to respond to the COVID-19 crisis that I would also tie back to Trump and the inaction that is occurring on why our communities are suffering more than they need to be. But these mutual aid networks work in partnership with multiple community organizations to address issues of shelter, of food security, of access and linkages to healthcare, in particular trans-affirming care and HIV care, and mental health care, which are the three primary areas where we found that communities were suffering the most based off of studies we did here in our local region. And probably could be also applied across the country too, in terms of the biggest needs that communities are facing. So creating up those systems where people are able to be the decision makers, and other systems where we're able to support ourselves, because these systems weren't made for us. Philanthropy wasn't made for the Contigos of the world. In retrospect, Contigo is the only type of Contigo there is. We're the first and only LGBTQ Latinx Fund in the United States. And it caused a incidence of mass tragedy to catalyze the support needed to get us started on that journey. And so all of this goes to prove that there is so many lessons that we have learned. If you invest in the right people, the doggos of the world, the Bambis of the world, if you invest in people who are closest to those issues, and invest in their leadership, then you have a way to then support movements and infrastructure building that we're currently lacking. So many dollars go to national organizations that are also doing good work, but so few dollars make it into the hands of communities who are closest to the issues that they're facing, and challenges that they're confronting in their lives today. And in the immigrant community has wholesale been excluded from the COVID recovery through CARES Act funding. Essential workers who are literally on the front lines of supporting the recovery aren't themselves being supported and are currently facing homelessness because of the inaction and xenophobic policies and practices that this administration has been implementing. And so I would say, like, the biggest lesson here for me and what I'm feeling right now is the sense of urgency of now. The fact that anti-immigrant, xenophobic a narrative was placed on the ballot in 2 major elections, and in one we got an authoritarian leader that was detrimental and demonstrated the kind of like demolishing of democracy that could happen through the inaction of a progressive base being able to protect itself. And 2, it was on the ballot again, and then we saw over 70 million individuals side with xenophobia. Over 70 million, more voters than Obama had in both of his previous elections. And so now we're in this urgency of a moment where we're here now having to battle a narrative that says that immigrants can be used as scapegoats, and a narrative that says that the Latino vote isn't a monolith, and that there's a growing trend of Latinx individuals or Latino or Hispanic identifying individuals who are siding with xenophobic policymakers and individuals who want to see our communities in pain. And so, like, it all goes back, and all this to say, like, being here in Florida gave me a really good perspective on the vote here, of the Latinx vote here in the state of Florida, with Cuban Americans, with Nicaraguans, with Hondurans, Central Americans here in South Florida in particular. And one of the things I would say, the last piece around of investing in leadership, investing in new infrastructure that's grassroots, that's led by and for. And the third one is investments, like deep investments in movements. Because one of the things that we learned here is that you can't treat the Latinx community as a monolith. They aren't reliably democratic. And 2, the only times you've ever shown up in the state of Florida is every 4 years during an election, where funders show up in the millions of dollars to influence the election, and the only door knocks or phone calls or types of engagement that communities who are living at the center of injustice are experiencing is every 4 years when people want to get out their vote and use them for a vote. And so this is a huge, I hope, lesson to the Democratic Party about not taking advantage of our communities, of having to invest deeply into the education, leadership, and futures of our communities to ensure that they're thriving enough to see the hope and the actual message that the Democratic Party has been having in terms of like what its dream would be of building a greater middle class and opportunity for all, but often leave our people behind.
I want to take something that you just said, Marco, which I find really interesting, and I tend to agree with it. As you said, xenophobia was on the ballot, both in 2020 as well as in 2016. So my question to Dago, with that in mind, how did Trans Queer Pueblo respond to that situation in Arizona? Talk about just the last 4 years and how you and your colleagues have responded to that situation or worked within that framework in that situation.
Yeah, interesting, right? Because I think what happened in 2016, it's not a reality that we hadn't experienced as people of color. So I think what happened was actually that a lot of the progressive movement finally was able to take off their masks and really see this democracy the way that it is, right? It is a white supremacy-led institution. And so I think it is important, though, and I think in our analysis is very clear that actually the problem lies within a system that allows for an outright president who constantly lies, who isn't questioned, to be in power. And so I think and we think actually that this is very purposeful, because what it actually did is actually pushed the Democratic candidates and the Democratic Party more to the right. And I think it is important because one of the things that we were working on was really understanding the narratives that were coming in the last 4 years, right? That rather than pushing for the liberation of people, like institutions and grassroots organizations were okay with saying, like, let's just cage them together. And I think that is important because I think that is a shift that we saw that Trump was able to make. And I think it also allowed for the LGBT movement to be more centrist. And I think one of the things that we continue to do and will continue to do was really make sure that we are providing basic services. I think Bambi said something important about services, providing services, right? Essential services are important. We can't build a movement if people don't have access to healthcare, if people are dying. We can continue to push if people don't have a home to go to. And so the past 4 years for us was really about making sure that we were building the foundations to make sure that new immigrants and LGBT people of color have the basic needs to continue to push and to continue to survive. I think it was exhausting. I think it's still exhausting. I don't think we are done. I think Trump has done so much damage that it's going to take about a decade to really undo everything that he has done, right? And again, we're going to start hearing these things from our friends. We got to wait, like democracy takes time. Well, again, we're losing lives. But I think it is important for us to continue, like Bambi said, to provide services that are essential for people so that they can continue fighting. And another thing was really understanding, one of the things that we even talked about, like what happens if like this Trump presidency starts searching and starts raiding. I mean, raids have happened, but really start targeting our undocumented brothers and sisters. What is our plan to really make sure that they don't get deported, right? And I think what we saw was literally that, right? They came for organizers, they put them in detention center, they deported some of them, and then the rest of us were here trying to make as much noise but not be noticed also at the same time, because we understood what was going to happen to us. And so last 4 years, I think I can summarize it by building foundation, building leadership, and continuing to build hope and courage, because I think that is what's going to continue to push us forward with this Biden administration.
One of the things that we have covered at The Blade, as Dago and Bambi and Marco probably knows too, is that just the situation in which LGBTQ migrants and asylum seekers are detained. I myself visited Cibola about 1.5 years ago. My colleague was in ICE custody in Louisiana for almost a year. Bambi, I know that, I know that Trans Latina Coalition has been really one of the organizations at the forefront of challenging the conditions in which folks are kept in ICE custody. talk a little bit about that and how are those conditions deteriorated under the Trump administration, especially for LGBT and transgender women in particular?
Um, I mean, just to add a little bit to what Dago also said, right? I mean, I think it's important for us to understand that our communities, right, and trans people specifically, right, the trans community, um, has been under attack for many administrations, actually for centuries, right? I mean, there have been policies to try to erase our existence since the beginning of the colonization, right? You know, gender expansive and trans people, right? Has it seems to me like that their mission has been to erase who we are, right? Through the doctrinization of religion, for instance, right? And so what Diego talked about, it's not something that that is new to us, to be honest with you, right? I mean, people think that yes, it is true that the those individuals who were racist are now like bluntly racist, like the Trump administration given permission to do that, right? But all of those issues have existed like long before, right? um and the deportation of our peoples, the detention of our peoples, right, particularly trans women. I remember many years ago, when I was in immigration detention, even before there was this sort of like transgender pod that they created to better the conditions of trans people, right? I was physically attacked, right? When I was in immigration detention. And so, this is not new. Like we have been supporting our people, we have been feeding our people, we've been housing our people, with no resources. Like we actually have been putting resources, right? And so I think there's this misunderstanding that is happening within our communities, or within our society as a whole, particularly those who hold power, right? Of the true meaning of social justice, right? You know, you can be a social justice warrior if you are a marginalizer, right? Or if you're an oppressor, right? And there are many people who work in the philanthropic world that are actually doing that, right? That are actually, um, oppressing people on a way that they're not even probably acknowledging it, right? And I'm talking about like trans people and immigrant people and people who we work with, really. um, and so this notion that when Trump came into office is when our communities is starting to having survival issues. That's not true, because we have been surviving for a long time. I think what is happening now is that you know our people are coming into our power, and we are organizing, and we are mobilizing in whatever ways possible. As Dago mentioned, right? Some of us have been making noise. I, as also as an undocumented person, right, having exposing myself, to potentially being detained and potentially deported. But that's what needs to happen, right? That's what needs to happen for people to acknowledge, for people to see the realities that we experience. But the question is, what is it that they are going to do to address these things, right?
Yeah.
We can't continue to just, como se dice, hablar nomás por hablar. You know what I mean? Like we can just say something to say, right? Like we need to actually put intention and action into what we're saying. That's why it's important that we understand, this concept of social justice, and also this, we need to be able to learn to mean what we say and say what we mean, right? Again, we can't just say, yes, I support you, yes, I understand the issue, if there's no action behind it. And so that's why it's important that we understand how the immigration system works, for instance, right? You know, we have to understand that the immigration systems functions exactly as the judicial system, right? Both the incarceral system, which is also an immigration system, right? They're both money making machines, right? They make money off people, and those are industries that have been built by our own government, right? That have been designed to detain our peoples, to incarcerate our peoples for the contractors that they are contracting with to make money, and to continue to oppress us, continues to keep us in the margins, for us not to continue to move forward and be the amazing and powerful people that we are, right? And so yeah, it's a lot of for the lack of a better word, a lot of bullshit that happens, right? And so we need to stop the bullshit, really, and actually, you know, do something rather than just say something.
I'm so glad you said that, Bambi. Thank you so much for that. We have a little bit under 10 minutes left, and I want to wrap it up with, again, we're about 50, give or take, days from the new administration coming in. So I want to start with Marco with this question. What are your thoughts about the Biden-Harris administration, and will anything change on immigration, and will anything tangible change on immigration and the other issues about which we collectively care? So Marco, your thoughts?
What I would say about Biden and Harris administration is that it makes me a little bit more hopeful than the last 4 years. Absolutely. But if it's any indicator, if the Obama administrator was any indicator of what we may expect from a Biden administration, then that's not the type. I'm hopeful that we're not going to get a Obama 3.0 administration for the immigrant community. Another person who speaks about wanting to bring justice to our communities, but exacerbates and builds systems of injustice that long live past their administration. And so for me, like when I was talking about the urgency of now, it's also the urgency of keeping people accountable to what they promised our people. Because we have been at the forefront of fighting against these other xenophobic opponents who and helping these other individuals now come into power. But ultimately, we have a really we have to keep not only the Biden and Harris administration accountable. We have to keep individual political leaders across our government accountable, because we have a Trump base of politicians now that believe that they can win with a Trumpist approach, with an anti-immigrant approach, because this last election wasn't a referendum, wasn't a full referendum against Trump. He's gotten more votes than any other losing presidential candidate has gotten in U.S. history. And in addition to that, the Senate, the House of Representatives, the individuals who ran on supporting Trump every step of the way still stayed in power. And so what does this mean for us? It's a huge narrative battle for us. It's a huge battle to keep people in government across our government accountable. It's to keep people in the private sector accountable, and on our nonprofit sector accountable, within our communities accountable. Because my concern isn't what's going to happen in these next 4 years of Biden and Harris. My major concern is what's going to happen in 2024, and whether or not our immigrant community is going to yet again be on the ballot again in 2024. And if we do not do the thoughtful investment and the thoughtful engagement and the thoughtful work that needs to happen today to really center the needs of our immigrant community and lift up their leadership to meet 2024, then Trump has already said, like, hey, we're trying to get it in these next 4 years, but if we don't, then I'll see you in 4 more.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's Trump or an even more deceivingly polished politician who will create great damage to the rest of our country, I still see a path for individuals who are opponents of our communities to take power back. And so what can we do today to prevent that from happening?
Dago, you're shaking your head in agreement with Marco. It looks like you share his concerns about 2024.
Yeah, well, I think that this is an opportunity, right? And I think it's an opportunity to really push for a radical reality that really takes us into consideration, right? I don't think much is going to change, but I do think that we can start building the foundations to resist, just like Marco said. I think that the Biden administration is not necessarily what we were hoping for, but I think it is what the Democratic Party decided to go for, because again, I think when we look at the political realities, the Democratic Party is a centrist party, not necessarily a leftist party. So when we think about the US will always be on the center unless there is a new proposition for a different party. And so I think what we can do is continue to build our power as community to really start pushing people and launching candidates that actually reflect our reality, candidates of color that don't have to abide by these two-party system that will never represent us, because that was
what, last but certainly not least, Bambi, your thoughts going into the next 4 years and beyond if Biden-Harris does not stay in power after 2024.
Yeah, I am hopeful, certainly, for sure. But I definitely agree with both Lago and Marco that there needs to be a lot of work, to let individuals and people understand, right, what needs to be done, right? And as Dago said, like, there needs to be a radical change, right? And I think it's possible, but I don't think it's going to happen in the next 4 years. What I do hope is that I get to live to see the world that I am hoping to live in, right? I am hoping that trans people can live in a world where they can live without fear to be who they are, right? That they can walk anywhere they want to without thinking that we are going to be killed, right? That we are not going to be detained simply because of who we are, that we're not criminalized because of who we are. And so I am hopeful, but I'm also hopeful that I'm hoping that this administration, upcoming administration, really really puts their money where their mouth is, right? Because we know that money is power, and if there is, again, an intentional investment in our peoples, then we are going to be able to change a little bit the the livelihood of our people. And so when there is an intentional investment of our peoples, then we are going to radically change how the world sees us.
I think that's a wonderful way to end this panel. So I want to thank Bambi, Dago, and Marco for a wonderful hour conversation, and we'll certainly continue to follow what happens. And I really look forward to another opportunity to talk to you, whether in person or virtually. And again, thank you so much for your time, and thank you all for watching, and have a good rest of your day.
Bye. Bye, muchachos.
Gracias.
Bye.
Gracias.